Outburst, a Todd Mills Mystery, Book 4. Author, R.D. Zimmerman. Publisher, Scribble Pub, Minneapolis, Minnesota, 1998. Narrator, Eric Aust. Acknowledgements. Many thanks to those who so generously shared their expertise and encouragement, including investigative reporter Gail Plowacki, producer Kara King, senior assistant Hennepin County Attorney Catherine Quintance, Sergeant Rob Allen, Dr. Don Hugh, Gail and Betsy Leandor Wright for their insights and wisdom, Ellen Hart, Katie, Lars, Chiara, my wonderful editor Tom Spain, and of course the very many transgendered people who shared their joys, hopes, and triumphs both in a number of books and on the internet. I tried to get it right. Forgive me if I didn't. While there have been cases of genital injury, this novel is a work of fiction. The names, characters, places, and incidents in this novel are the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events, or locals is entirely coincidental. Prologue. Late June. Sex was the last thing on her mind when she'd agreed to help cater the benefit, but it was the first thing she thought of when she saw him. Dressed in a snug black and white uniform, Chris was carrying a tray of canapes, little half-moon pastries filled with smoked duck, and a tiny bit of chutney. When she turned from one small group of guests to the next, and there he was, standing in front of the dark oak bookcase. Tall, brown hair gone quite silver, blue suit, blue tie, blue eyes, a strikingly handsome face, perhaps once a bit boyish, now simply and utterly endearing. She, a born and bred Minnesota beauty with short blonde hair that she curled to give it height and body, held out the silver-plated tray, found her voice, and said, "Care for an appetizer, sir?" He turned from a man in a brown suit with whom he was discussing something about the stock market. Up, up, up! Isn't it great? Glanced over the platter of beautifully arranged food, then looked at her, and that's what scared Chris. For their eyes met and held on, which in turn sent a rush coursing through Chris's lithe body. She was so quickly aroused that later she would look back on the moment and think that it was as if he'd thrown a switch on in her. No, a circuit breaker. She would silently laugh because she'd never felt anything so powerful before, but right then and there she concentrated on holding the tray steady, which proved no easy feat, for he reached for one of the hot canopies and brushed the back of one of his large, warm, hairy hands against her long fingers. Chris tremored as if she were being penetrated. "Whatever you do, girl, don't drop this fucking tray, 'cause you'll get your ass fired and you need the money. You know you do." Then quickly turned. She was in her early 20s. He had to be in his mid-40s, if not early 50s. Surely this guy, whoever he was old enough to be her father. Get away, that was all Chris could think of. She looked the innocent sort, but the stark truth was that she'd had trouble enough in her young life, had done more in bed with more guys than most women would do in a lifetime. And so she was wise, well beyond her years. She knew what had just happened here, just as she knew it could come to no good. Escaping from him, Chris continued through the largest home she'd ever been in, a stucco mansion built by some Farina heir 90 years ago. A huge buttercream structure that fancied itself on the hills of Tuscany, rather than on the west side of Lake of the Isles in Minneapolis. Chris scurried from the library and into the massive entry hall, a vaulted space with a black and white marble floor, and now filled with perhaps 50 or 60 guests, sipping champagne and munching everything from the smoked duck pastries to pepper-crusted beef crostini. Only one person, a slim, short man of average looks, with what seemed a perpetual frown, had neither food nor drink. Chris could turn on her manners as easily as she could her coyness, and she extended the tray of Hors d'oeuvres to him and said, "Wouldn't you care for something? You've been standing by the front door all evening." "No," he said, pushing up his glasses with his right index finger and glancing quickly at her. "Not while I'm working." Such was this law clerk, the host's assistant, who by all accounts was a tad nerdy. Obviously brilliant, very severe. He'd not only taken it upon himself to welcome each and every guest into the McMartin home. The McMartins, scions of the local newspaper family, were off hiking in Tibet and had loaned out their house for tonight's event. But to oversee virtually every aspect of the event and back in the kitchen, Chris had been forewarned that this guy, not his boss, the judge, would be the difficult one to please. In other words, beware the hired pain in the ass. "Of course," Chris replied, her lips parting into a gentle smile, for she was first and foremost a temptress. "But how will you know if our food is up to your expectations if you don't try anything?" "Oh, right," he said, focusing on the canapes with workmanlike concentration. Offering him a napkin, Chris added, "The duck ones are my favorite. They're luscious." After examining them all, he chose one and shoved the entire thing into his mouth. When fresh guests suddenly appeared at the door, however, he all but jumped and all but swallowed his food whole. He then quickly, carefully, nervously wiped his right hand and held it up. "Thank you for coming to the fundraiser. I'm the judge's law clerk, Douglas Sims." Turning back to the guests, Chris foisted the rest of her food on several clumps of people, then headed toward the living room. But first she glanced back. No, he hadn't emerged from the book-lined room, wasn't lingering in the doorway, as she had both half hoped and feared. Nothing. That was nothing back there, she told herself. And you should be glad. Carrying her empty tray, Chris descended 2 steps into the living room, a huge space that alone was bigger and taller than most houses. There were supposed to be some 300 people here, which it most definitely seemed there were, to raise money for the Poverty Law Foundation. Chris even recognized some, including the milquetoast mayor of Minneapolis and a clump of media personalities. Turning, she even saw that gay guy from TV, Todd Mills, who was now trying to bear up as Babs Curtis, the larger-than-life radio personality with the large voice and pearls, was assaulting him with her large banter. Chris even scored a scowl from Miss Curtis, who, unseen by virtually anyone else, puffed out her chest as if to say, "Young lady, you may have gorgeously slim legs, lips like an overripe plum, a nice flat tummy, and the most lascivious of faces. But girlfriend, those titties of yours are nothing compared to these bosoms." And thank God for that, thought Chris, hurrying along. Sure, she could use a little more chest, but not jugs like those. She proceeded along the back wall of the living room and past the grand piano, where some bald guy in a tux was playing like light classical music that was all but drowned out by the buzz of the crowd. As she slipped past the Steinway, the musician, who was certainly old enough to be her grandfather, swooned toward her and mouthed, "I love you." Shit, she thought with a sour smile. Too much makeup. Chris had waitressed before, but she'd never worked a catered party, and she was here only because her neighbor and pal Bert had begged her just 3 hours ago. "Two of our waiters have this summer flu thing," he pleaded. "I'm beyond desperate." "This is the biggest contract Travis has ever got," Bert said, referring to his boyfriend, Travis, with whom he owned Peacock Catering. "And every rich person in town is going to be there because the buzz is that this really isn't about raising money for some stupid foundation. No, they're saying this is really Judge Stewart Hawkins' debutante ball. Supposedly, he's just a few weeks from resigning so we can run for governor. We blow this and Travis might as well flush his business down the toilet. We succeed and we'll be catering banquets for the future governor. Because if Hawkins does in fact run, he's sure as hell going to get elected." "Okay," Chris had said, "but how was she supposed to know that you weren't supposed to outshine these matrons?" That 6 o'clock in the evening was much too early for the depth of her eyeliner and the richness of her lipstick. She was only just learning how to tone down her beauty, that only a hint of makeup made her blue eyes and high cheekbones look more classic than cheap. Yes, she, with her short blonde hair and her slim but regal stature, was a real Scandinavian beauty. She knew that for a fact, couldn't help but pass as such. On the far side of the room, Chris climbed 2 steps and passed through an arch into the dining room, and there he was, so utterly handsome and so obviously waiting in ambush. An empty glass of champagne in one hand, a crumpled napkin in the other. The silver-haired man fixed his eyes on her, as steady as headlights on a doe. More than several people noticed. Chris was sure, and this time her pale skin flushed, not with desire, but with embarrassment. He took a half-step toward her, his thin lips parted, and Chris ducked to the right, whooshing through a swinging door, passing through a pantry that was lined with fine dishes and crystal glasses, then entering the huge kitchen. Chris swung her doily-covered platter onto the center island and stood there. Shit, why had she agreed to do this? "What's the matter, dollface?" asked Travis, dressed fully in chef drag, replete with the tall hat, as he used a pastry bag to squirt a dollop of artichoke mousse on a line of 5 dozen toast points. "You look all red. Listen, there's no way in hell you can get sick, too, but if you are, you go down through that door over there. You go into the basement where we got all our extra dishes, and you puke down there. Am I clear?" Chris nodded. "I'm fine." "Good. Then don't just stand there. Get these friggin' toast points out of here." She reached for them. "No!" screamed Travis. "Get yourself a new doily. Chris, that's one's all greasy. And put some parsley in the middle, for Christ's sake." Jan, red-haired and voluptuously plump, washed in with her empty tray, saying, "Travis, Judge Hawkins loves the Filio triangles. Got any more?" "Oh, fuck." Travis raced to the stove, threw open the door, and pulled out 2 cookie sheets of spinach and feta appetizers. The phyllo darkly browned, but not burnt. Thank God! There was no space, let alone time, to linger in here, so Chris loaded up her tray again, then headed out. Entering the dining room, she scanned the chamber. Flowers, tall and lush and colorful, stood in a vase on the long dinner table. Scattered about on mirrored trays were blanched asparagus spears, wrapped in prosciutto, imported cheeses, delicate crackers, and turkey tartlets. And on a sideboard sat huge silver coffee servers, rotund and steamy. But he was not about relieved. Chris continued with the job at hand, passing the artichoke mousse on toast points, which, considering this moneyed crowd, were seized with unsophisticated glee. Chris made it only midway into the living room before her fare was gone. She glanced through a group of people saw the piano player lifting both hands from the keyboard and blowing her a schmaltzy kiss. No one, though, seemed to notice his broadcasted affection, or, for that matter, the pause in music, since you could barely hear anything above the din of conversation. Only another hour and a half, thought Chris, and this would be over. These fancy folk would go back to their world, and she would retreat to hers. When she turned to head back to the kitchen, however, there he was. Chris's heart skipped along like a rock on water, then sank into heavy pounding. He stood in what could only be superficial conversation with a much older man in a double-breasted navy blue blazer and a gray-haired woman dripping with gold bangles and rock-sized jewels. Ah, shit, thought Chris. She'd always been attracted to older guys, but that had never meant someone over 30. Yet, here was this guy, and he was, she swore, the most attractive man she'd ever seen. And when their eyes locked again, this time, so briefly, she knew in a flash that they'd both be transported to the same lustful fantasy. Nearly paralyzed, Chris watched as he broke away from his conversation and started toward her, her flushed body telling her mind exactly what she didn't want to hear. Yes, he really wants you. Forget it, she told herself. Stop it. Not long ago, she'd sought her future in California, but instead had discovered troubled, the big kind, when she'd spread her legs for a hot guy, and this, she sensed, was no good. Too much the same. She spun the other way, heading not toward the kitchen and another load of canopies, but away from him and out the other end of the packed living room. As she made her way up the 2 steps, she saw him following. No, please. The cumbersome tray in hand, she darted past the judgmental eyes of Mr. Majordomo by the front door, past the library, down a narrow hall, and to a staircase that curled downward. As she glanced back, thought she'd lost him. Just to make sure, though, she descended, following the wooden steps down and into an old entertainment room, which, in this grand house, had a huge fireplace, wrought iron, light fixtures, dark oak woodwork, and a billiard table in the middle. Perhaps, thought Chris, she'd be able to hide here until the party was over. But no. Footsteps heavy and sure on the stairs sounded the alarm. Tossing her silver tray like a frisbee onto the billiard table, she darted toward a door, pulled it open, and entered a dark, unfinished basement. Chris passed beneath old pipes, dangling wires, while overhead, just atop those heavy beams, the party continued, footsteps clumping, voices laughing, and somewhere, broadcast better down here via vibration, the piano. She came around a corner, entered a workroom filled with old screen windows, a dusty air conditioner, and proceeded to a long workbench covered with a mound of tools and household supplies. She, Chris told herself as she leaned against the bench, was going to get her life in order. That was why she'd fled Los Angeles and returned home. It was about getting away from that dark shadow of that cop and his toxic brother, about healing, about getting her life in order. She deserved to be happy, damn it all, and she deserved a good man. She froze when she heard his footsteps glide across the concrete floor. With a husky tone, he called across the dank room, saying, "You're the most beautiful young woman I've ever seen." She wanted to cry right then and there, unable to believe that he was seeing her as such. Oh, God, you're not supposed to believe in this kind of guy. The perfect kind, the Prince Charming stud. But he was just that, wasn't he? Or shouldn't she at least find out? No, she should bolt away. He had to be like the one back in L.A., Nothing but a hurricane of problems. There was another way out of here, wasn't there? A staircase that would lead up to the kitchen? Yet, Chris didn't move, her back to him. She clutched the edge of the grimy bench and stood there in her tight black waitress uniform, her blonde hair flopping into her eyes. As his feet shuffled closer, Chris closed her eyes, bit her bottom lip. She wasn't a whore. She just wanted love. Someone who'd wrap his arms around her and tell her that all the pain she'd already experienced in this short life of hers was done. Over. No more. And he did just that. He came up behind her. She counted the steps. 5. Chris tensed as if she were about to be attacked, and then felt his arms slip around her trim waist and pull her against his strong, warm body. She started trembling, shaking all over. What was happening here? Couldn't he read her? Didn't he realize that it was she who was the black hole of chaos? He said, "It's okay." And by the way he said it, she understood that he didn't mean, "It's okay, I won't hurt you." No. He meant, from now on, everything's going to be fine. Chris swooned, yet he held her steady. She wanted to stand like this forever, facing a sea of chaos with this mountain of security embracing her from behind. But, of course, that was impossible, because through their layers of clothing she felt the strength of his erection rise and press up against her ass. In one swift whirl, she spun around, lifted her mouth to him, and they were kissing, her full lips pressing hard against his thin ones. Their tongues exploded and intertwined, and Chris reached beneath his suit coat and clawed at his back, used all the strength her thin arms could muster to pull him closer, closer, closer. She let herself be gobbled up, ran her moist lips over his clean-shaven cheek, drank in his cologne, felt his mouth on her ear. Above the flagrant lust, it flashed in Chris's mind. This is it. This is him. This is what I want. He reached down, caressed her tomboyish chest, then leaned over, kissed her neck, and of course, then he reached down, ran his meaty hand down her flat stomach. Lower, lower, lower. She grabbed his hand and said, "No!" "Oh my God, you're so beautiful." A moment of sanity prodded them. How old are you?" Old enough." With that, his fingers crept down an inch. She clutched his hand more tightly. I'm having my period," she pleaded, hoping she wouldn't have to tell him something like she bled a lot. Please." His hand was firm and unflinching, but Chris was experienced in these matters. She knew how to do this, knew how to handle the situation, send it careening off in another direction, and so she reached down, felt the hard metal of his belt buckle, felt the fine, thin wool of his pants, felt him rigid and determined. She stroked him once lightly, and he moaned from his gut, shook as if he'd never been touched, cornered against the bench. Chris slid down with one hand. She rubbed his crotch as lightly as she could, and then with the other reached up and popped open his buckle. With one quick tug, she ripped out his blue shirt, shoved up his white undershirt, and then lunged forward, rubbing her buttery soft cheek against the fur of his stomach. "Oh, Jesus," he moaned, his hands clawing through her hair. With one definitive strike, she ripped down his zipper, shoved down his pants, then grabbed at his red plaid boxers and nearly tore them away. He sprang out, and at first she knelt there in awe, recalling something she'd glimpsed atop the workbench. She reached with her left hand for a jar of petroleum jelly. Yes, she thought as she awkwardly popped open the container and smeared one of her fingers. She was going to take him somewhere he'd probably never been before. somewhere he'd certainly never forget. "Oh, God," he begged, his voice barely audible. "Suck me." She opened her mouth and drank him up as slowly, as luxuriantly, as if she were partaking of the finest armagnac. Her right hand embraced the base of his shaft, while the other reached down between his legs and crept toward his ass, and all at once he fell forward, bracing himself with both hands on the workbench. He groaned and cried, but then stiffened as he realized the direction of her wayward finger. "What? Are you—" Pulling him out of her mouth, she said, "Do you want to ride the naughty pony?" When it was clear he didn't understand, she added, "I just want to tickle your walnut." He laughed nervously. "My what?" "Your prostate." "What? How do you—" Her voice all velvet, Chris asked, "Come on. You saw Last Tango in Paris, didn't you?" She glanced up, saw the look of fear, even disgust, but went ahead before he could protest. First she sucked him back up. Next she just did it. She penetrated him. At first he tensed horribly so, but when she reached her nut-sized target, it was as if he'd been struck by some erotic lightning bolt. Of course, he'd never been taken like this, touched in this hidden corner of delight. That much was clear by the veins bursting in his neck, the deep scarlet color of his face, and his groans, which grew more animal-like with each thrust. And when she was through with him just a few minutes later, after she'd blown him to the moon and sucked him back again, she pulled herself up. The party was still going full force overhead, and he lifted his shorts and pants, then pulled a handkerchief from his breast pocket and handed it to her, watching as he made a feeble attempt at tucking his shirt. Chris wiped her hands and wondered if she'd ever see him again, this dream. Or had that been it, a shot in the dark, so to speak. "My name's Chris," she volunteered. "What's yours?" Suddenly, the very boyish side of him spread over his face. "You don't know?" "No. Why should I?" "Because I'm hosting this party. My name's Stuart. Stuart Harkins." Chris tried to speak, but couldn't, for there was no way she could tell him. She stared at him, the lust and love and fantasy she'd felt for this most manly man, now totally zapped. And then she burst into tears. This dream of a guy was Judge Stuart Hawkins? She darted to the side, outran his reach. "Hey!" he shouted. Chris wouldn't be stopped. She ran out of that dank workroom, charged into the hall, where Douglas Sims was now searching for his boss. He spied her through his thick glasses, and his serious face turned all the graver, for he was no dummy. He knew at once what was going on down there. "Come back!" snapped the aide. Chris spun around, darted the other way, tore through another door, into another room where Jan and several other servers were down getting more glassware. "Chris, you okay?" gasped Jan. Dan, one of the guys, asked, "What happened?" She saw the bathroom, a little yellow room with a ratty old toilet and sink. She ran in there, slammed and locked the door behind her. "Oh, Jesus Christ!" She turned and bent over the sink, sobbing as she never had done before. "Dear God in heaven, the most prominent judge in the state, the man who very well might be the next governor of Minnesota, would kill her if he ever found out her deepest secrets. Not simply that she'd been castrated in a freak accident, but that her real name wasn't Chris with a K, but Chris with a C, as in Christopher." Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.